Welcome back. The study shut down, and starting over. Not over all the way, but so if you are there, can you let me know at what point did I cut out? Because I'm not sure. All right. I'm just going to continue as if you guys watched the entire thing and never lost me. In fasting, so we're talking about fasting on page 166. In fasting, we abstain in some significant way from food and possibly from drink as well. This discipline teaches us a lot about ourselves very quickly. It's humiliating as it reveals to us how much our peace depends upon the pleasures of eating. It may also bring to mind how we are using food pleasure to assuage the discomforts caused in our bodies by faithless and unwise living and attitudes. It will certainly demonstrate how powerful and clever our body is in getting its own way. Fasting will, without a doubt, be probably the hardest of the spiritual disciplines for some of us here to practice. St. Anthony often subsisted for long. There's different degrees of fasting, he says. St. Anthony subsisted for long periods of time with nothing but bread and water. Daniel, the Daniel fast that was popular a while back was he refused to eat any meat or drink wine. So he ate only vegetables and drank water only for a time. Jesus, in the time of his preparation for temptation, did away with water, or did away with food in general. He'd have to still drink water. I mean, he'd have to drink something because you can't survive for a month and not drink fluids. Fasting confirms our utter dependence on God by finding in him a source of sustenance beyond food. And I'll testify, I've said this several times throughout the study, but fasting is so essential to our faith that I'm just shocked that more people don't take advantage of it. Especially if you struggle with any kind of addiction or any kind of bad habit. That doesn't just mean addictions. It could be drugs or alcohol, but it could be porn. It could be food. I mean, you might be just filling your need for comfort by eating food. Whatever it is, fasting absolutely can help. Because if you can, force your body to not have something it actually needs, like food, you can tell your body that it doesn't get to have things it doesn't need, but feels like our needs, like drugs or alcohol, or whatever your personal struggle is. Because despite what we know about drugs and everything, drugs feel like a need. Your body needs it. It feels like it needs it. And it is hard. But your body doesn't really need it. It's just your body's chemistry is confused and it feels like it needs it. But with food, your body literally needs it. So if you can fast from food, you have a much better chance of fasting from drugs or fasting from other things. You just have to get into a habit of doing it. So when Jesus directs us not, I'm on page 167. Jesus directs us not to appear distressed and sad when we fast. This, I'm not really sure if I agree with him on this, but let's just read it. He says he's not telling us to mislead those around us. That's absolutely true. He's instead explaining how we will feel. We will really not be sad. And I don't know if that's what he's actually saying. I personally think that when Jesus says to basically hide the fact that you're fasting, I think he's basically trying to tell us to keep it a secret, because it's not about other people seeing it. It's about you just doing it for your own sake and to grow your relationship with God. Anyway, that's just my little disagreement there. He says, Our belly is not our God. You're just trying to drive this home. Fasting is one of the more important ways of practicing self-denial required of everyone who would follow Christ. In fasting, we learn how to suffer happily as we feast on God. And it's a good lesson because in our lives, we will suffer. We have this quote from Thomas Kempis. He says, "Whoever knows best how to suffer will keep the greatest peace. That man is conqueror of himself, the Lord of the world and friend of Christ and heir of heaven." Persons well used to fasting as a systematic practice will have a clear and constant sense of their resources in God. And that will help them endure deprivations of all kinds, even to the point of coping with them easily and cheerfully, having joy and contentment, as we talked about in Ecclesiastes, despite having, suffered. Fasting teaches temperance or self-control, therefore teaches moderation and restraint with regard to all of our fundamental drives. Fasting will be diffused throughout our personality in the midst of all our needs and wants, that we experience the contentment of a child who has been weaned. 168. Fasting, though, is a hard discipline to practice without consuming all of our attention. When you're fasting, and I've practiced this spiritual discipline many, many, many times, at first, when you're doing it, it consumes your thoughts. I mean, you are thinking about fasting because your stomach is growling. And then you are thinking about fasting because you are just hungry. It consumes your thoughts, but it's good. It helps you to be very cognizant of how your mind oftentimes wanders without you wanting it to. When a person chooses fasting as a spiritual discipline, he or she must then practice it well enough and often enough to become experienced in it, because only the person who is well habituated to systematic fasting as a discipline can use it effectively as a part of direct service to God. And that's important. The next spiritual gift is frugality. We're almost done. Frugality, we abstain from using money or goods at our disposal in ways that merely gratify our desires or our hunger for status, glamour, or luxury. Practicing frugality means we stay within the bounds of what general good judgment would designate as necessary for the kind of life to which God has led us. So the ancient Spartans prohibited themselves from buying stuff or building stuff that couldn't be made with an axe and a saw. Romans frequently had limits on expenses. English law had limits on food and clothing. John Calvin famously, when he controlled Geneva, set all kinds of laws in place to limit people on frugality. That doesn't mean that those things are good to do, but the point is that frugality has been practiced for a long time. That's all he's saying. James says, Go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl for the miseries that shall come upon you. And James is warning the rich people, 169, not simply because they're rich, but because they find their pleasure on earth and they found it wanting. Again, we're seeing a ton of overlap. This is how you know, this is when you know that God is oftentimes in something or trying to guide you through something, when you are seeing the same message in multiple places and you're not looking for it. There are a lot of times where we want to believe something that is ungodly and we look for confirmation. But God oftentimes works where he confirms things that you actually did not agree with, or he confirms things in ways when you are not looking for confirmation. If you're looking for confirmation, oftentimes, then you're actually just self-fulfilling prophecy. The spiritually wise person has always known that frivolous consumption corrupts the soul away from trust in, worship of, and service of God, and injures our neighbors as well. Frugality is a service to God and humankind. Our concern here is with this discipline. It frees us from the concern and involvement with a multitude of desires that would make it impossible for us to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. A large part of freedom that comes from frugality is freedom from spiritual bondage caused by financial debt. Oh my gosh. My goodness, so many times people don't realize how much their car or their house that they actually bought at the tippy top of their threshold for income is stressing their marriage or stressing their relationships. It's just ridiculous. The Bible very clearly says that you are a slave to the debtor. You're a slave to whoever you owe money to. Frugality saves us from that kind of slavery. A large part of the freedom that comes from frugality is freedom from spiritual bondage, from financial debt. Jump to page 170. Frugality as a settled style of life frees us from indifferent things. Ideas of simplicity and living in poverty are spiritual disciplines. We'll skip that. Chastity. Chastity has to do with sex. Chastity, we purposefully turn away from dwelling upon or engaging in sexual dimension of our relationship to others, even husbands and wives sometimes. Sexuality is one of the most powerful and subtle forces in the human nature. And the percentage of human suffering tied directly to it is horrifying. This is a fact. Abortion would go away if people would not engage in sexual activity outside of God's design. Human abuse stemming from sex also. I mean, jeepers, so much stuff. Rape and, it's awful. So it's important for us to learn how to govern it. Abstention within marriage by mutual agreement has been considered, counseled by Paul, for example, as an aid to fasting and prayer. Voluntary abstention helps us to appreciate and love our mates as whole persons, not just as objects. Chastity thus has an important part to play within marriage, but the main effect we seek through it is the proper disposal of sexual acts, feelings, and thoughts and attitudes. Page 171. Is this to say our sexuality is something to shun? That is impossible. We are sexual beings. We're not saying that sex is bad. Again, there's nothing wrong with sex within the guidelines of how we were created, the purposes and defined definitions that we were created for. So we're not saying that. Our sexuality reaches into the essence of our being, he says. Therefore, chastity does not mean you're non-sexual. It is just creating a habit of not being controlled by your sexual desires. Page 172. Chastity, rightly practiced as a part of an overall rich walk with God, can draw the poison from sexual abstinence and prevent the sickness of heart and mind that now runs amok in the sexual dimension of our lives today. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who we've talked about a lot in church, was a World War II pastor who fought against Hitler, was captured and killed in a concentration camp. He says this, he said, the essence of chastity is not the suppression of lust, but the total orientation of one's life toward a goal. Healthy abstention in chastity can only be supported by loving, positive involvement with members of the opposite sex. Alienation from the opposite sex would actually not be helpful. It's hard because, you don't want to be in a situation where you're shunning, where he talks about the sexual abuse. If you were abused, it's one of those things that we take for granted a lot, is the giving, for example, giving for the sake of, without anybody knowing that you're just giving for the sake of giving. One of the greatest fallacies of our faith, and actually one of the greatest acts of unbelief, is that the thought that our spiritual acts and virtues need to be advertised to be known. When you give when you tithe, for example, and don't tell anybody, you get to see God move, and you get to trust in God that he's doing the right things with whatever it is you're giving. Secrecy, rightly practiced, enables us to place our public relations department entirely in the hands of God. We allow him to decide when our deeds will be known and when our light will be noticed. Secrecy at its best teaches love and humility before God and others. So if you want to experience a flow of love as never before, the next time you are in a competitive situation, pray for the people you're competing against to do their very best. Secrecy has yet another important dimension as a spiritual discipline. The needs that arise in our efforts to serve God can often be handled by looking to God only, not telling others that there's a need, but counting on God to just do it. If we see needs met because we have asked God alone, our faith in God's presence and care will be greatly increased. Yesterday, I was talking to Bruce, one of the guys at our church, and Bruce said that he was praying for God to basically solve this thing he had going on. He didn't tell anybody that he had a problem. He didn't ask for help. He just prayed, and he prayed and he prayed and he prayed for like a week. And then the problem got solved. And what he did was he actually contributed that all to God. At no point did he go, man, look at all the things I did to solve this issue. He completely gave it to God because he had prayed for that in private and didn't ask for help. Finally, sacrifice, and then we'll be done. I know that we've been having tons of issues with the internet. I'm pretty sure it's on our end, so I apologize. We're in the process of looking for a new carrier, just all kinds of stuff. Anyway, sacrifice, the discipline of sacrifice. We abstain from the possession of or enjoyment of what is necessary for living. Not like in frugality. The discipline of sacrifice is one in which we forsake the security of meeting our own needs. It's a total abandonment to God. This is one of the sacrifice is one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself. It's better to give than receive, like what Jesus talked about. Stepping into the dark abyss of your faith and hope that God will bear you up. Abraham sacrificing Isaac. When it comes to tithing, again, I cannot emphasize. I know I'm a pastor, so it seems like I'm invested in whether or not you tithe. To be honest with you, I have complete and utter trust in God. I am not. I'm not going to be begging for a new jet. But I know without a doubt from personal experience and the experience of others that tithing, giving 10% of your gross income and trusting God to make the difference will without a doubt change your entire outlook on life. No doubt in my mind. Every person that's ever practiced it has always told me that. I've never had somebody tithe and then tell me they regretted it. Ever, not ever once. And we see this gift of sacrifice in the widow. She gave more to God with her 2 pennies than all the rich gentlemen did with their large tax-deductible checks. Again, sacrifice is dependent upon where you are at. You don't have to match the gift of John Smith, who happens to be a millionaire, but sacrificing and giving more is that's what sacrifice is, and then trusting God to give the increase.